Chris Thomas, who is a short-term rental investor. We have David Orange, who is a STR manager. He manages a whole bunch of short-term rentals. And then we have Rachel Mandel and Joe Haberman, and they are both with planning and design, and Joe is the head of the group. So I really like to welcome you all, panelists. So how about if we just go around, do a quick introduction and just briefly say something about yourself, starting with Chris.
Thanks, Santosh. Everyone should know you should be extra nice to Joe and who's the other one? Rachel. Those are the two that you got to be nice to. Anywho, yeah, my name's Chris. I'm in the office. You guys know me probably a little bit. So we've been doing short-term rentals for, I don't know, maybe 3 years roundabout. Thanks, David. And so we are, we really like we really like what it affords us. I know we're going to get into that in a little bit, in terms of, you know, rent is obviously nice, but also leverage, having a manager who knows his way around and that sort of thing. I don't know what else. That's what I would say to kind of kick things off.
Sounds great. David?
Yeah, so my name's David Orange. I own and operate Orange Corp Management. We have an office located in the Highlands now. The huge bulk of our business comes from Keller Williams. We've been doing this since 2016 and just steadily growing, always keeping a finger on the pulse, always staying in front of the technology, always staying in front of, you know, city ordinances and what's happening in that realm. And we do a lot more. It's really just a full turnkey shop. We do a lot more than just simply, you know, changing sheets and cleaning. And we like to be able to, you know, be that subject matter expert for when it comes to this type of investment.
Sounds great. Rachel Mandel, would you please kindly introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Rachel with Planning and Design Services. I'm an associate planner. When it comes to short-term rentals, what I mostly do is the administrative side, so handling registrations and answering questions for the public, specifically David Orange. Pretty much all I do is help David Orange.
Sounds good. Joe, thanks for coming, and would you be kind and talk about what you do?
Sure, I'm Joe Haberman. I'm a planning manager at Planning and Design. Just for some background, for better or for worse, I drafted the short-term rental ordinance on behalf of Metro Council. So I'm kind of one of the architects behind some of the provisions, so I know the reasoning for some of them. I also oversee enforcement, so I might be able to answer some questions with that. But as far as the day-to-day, Rachel and Heather Pollock are really the ones that can answer the questions about the process because they're the ones that see it through.
Awesome, awesome. Thanks for coming. So let's go back to Chris. So Chris, can you just briefly talk about how you got started and what steered you toward short-term rentals?
We decided, well, sort of on the recommendation of Nick Pesco. Nick was doing, I think he's who introduced me to David, and was doing a triplex over somewhere. I don't remember exactly, but bottom line is he was telling me about how they had converted one and how it was going and things. And, you know, when you do long-term rentals, you have to do a lot. I have to do a lot of work on the long-term rentals to get them rented, to meet people, to have no shows. You deal with, you know, having to kick people out at times. You make the wrong call, or life happens to a tenant and they can't pay. So we, you know, it was attractive to us in the sense that we knew that we had someone who knew what they were doing, even though, gosh, David, you were brand new in it, as was most people at that point. So it was nice to know that, like, we could turn this over and he was going to handle, you know, pretty much everything. I mean, outside of maintenance, we do the maintenance, obviously, but the things that, you know, he's going to have his eyes on it regularly. The numbers make sense in terms of, my big thing was, can we get these things to outperform long-term rentals rent wise. And if they do, it doesn't make sense not to do that from a leverage standpoint. So that's kind of where we got intrigued by it. And then we bought a couple, I guess, specifically for that. And then we also converted a couple of long-terms as well to short-term.
So you've been doing this for about 4 years now. Do you feel comfortable to
Maybe three.
share? 3?
I'm sorry.
Okay. Do you feel comfortable to share how many short-term rentals do you have versus the traditional rentals?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. We have, let me think here. We have, let's see, five that are currently, thank you, 5 that are currently operating that way. And we have, of course, we closed on a building in Nulu literally the morning that everything canceled, everything got shut down back in March, that we had, because of its zoning, it's zoned properly where you can do a short-term rental. We were going to do short-term on that one. That's 3 units. We are converting one of those units as of today or this week, because the tenant left. And so we are going to move that one. So we'll have 3 more once that's done.
Okay. All right. So let's talk to David. David, you've been managing properties for what, 3-4 years also? You there, David?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. So yeah, I've been doing this for, let's see, since 2016, and actually pretty much started generally, I mean, really before the ordinance was even written. And it was done with a sublet townhouse. That's actually where it started. Over in St. Matthews, which actually isn't even governed under the ordinance at this point, but, or at least I believe. So yeah, it started there. It started with meeting Nick Pesco. It started with, and I tell Nick all the time, it's like, it was you running your mouth that built this thing. And I'm a data architect by trade. So really what it started with was kind of starting to discover and understand that every day has a different value to it. No 2 days really are alike at all. I have my pricing screen that's kind of loaded up right behind me. And I mean, it's, day to day, it's $84, $86, $112, $130, $93, $107. And this is all done with an algorithm. It used to be something that I was able to do manually. But as we've grown, we've invested, quite a bit in technology, and we're at about 30 units now. But our knowledge, I mean, it really just came from, applying what I knew about data and the science of that, and learning. It was really, as Chris pointed out, I really started in this, when I first started with, Chris and you, and I've grown and just kind of learned with it. This is now it's a fairly large operation now. I mean, from a small business standpoint, I guess you could say. We have a facility on Bardstown Road where everything is kept in house. We kind of tried to take the IKEA model when it came to, managing short-term rentals. And by that, I mean, we bought the sawmill and we bought the forest. You try to keep everything 100% in house. You don't have to outsource any of it. And it's actually going to, it's going to benefit the investor. That's always been the goal. You take care of people, they're going to keep coming back. And that's always the idea, is like, what's going to generate the best return so that we can continue to, see growth and continue to help build portfolios. As far as just learning how everything works, Rachel and Joe have both been really instrumental in that. Rachel specifically, I try not to bother Joe. But Rachel in particular, she's someone that I know that I've been able to turn to whenever I have questions, and whenever, like you and I are talking about a potential investment in a property, I can sit here and tell you all day what it's going to make. And I can pretty much nail down the majority of the ordinance and how that works. But when I have questions, or I just want kind of the second opinion so that everyone can have the warm, fuzzy feeling. It's really Rachel that is able to provide that. But our knowledge is really it's come from lessons learned. There's really no other way around it. 5,000 plus trips hosted, and growing. So that's really where it comes from.
I'll come back to you here, David, in a few and ask a few more questions. Now let's go to Rachel and Gary, whoever feels comfortable. For the group here, there are some realtors here who probably want to know more about what a short-term rental is. Can you just briefly talk about short-term rental, and also if you can talk about, I think Joe touched on this, that he was responsible for writing the ordinance, and if he can actually touch on what was the motivation behind it, how did this whole process get started? And so if Rachel and Joe can touch on, be great.
Sure, I'll start with just the definition. So a short-term rental is when you lease a unit for 30 consecutive days or less. But it's not going to be, a hotel or a bed and breakfast where food services are offered, things like that. It's just simply defined as a consecutive stay of 30 days or less. And then if Joe wanted to touch on the ordinance side.
So Louisville's always been kind of a front runner in short-term rentals, but it was always 1 week out of the year. So what happened was when we started to get people renting other times of the years, whether that was for NCAA tournaments, golf tournaments, things like that, it started to get a lot of complaints in the neighborhoods because they were completely unregulated. It was the Wild West. So Metro took the position that you just can't do them. But that was just, kind of to put in place until we figured something out. And so we went ahead and put the ordinance because I think Metro Council understood that, these can be a benefit to certain areas if regulated properly and they don't oversaturate an area. So we went ahead and we put that ordinance together with that in mind in 2016 to kind of find that balance. So it's been in place for about 4 years now, and Metro Council has also shown that this is evolving and they want to go ahead and look at it every few years and made some pretty significant upgrades to the ordinance about a year ago. So the main point of the ordinance is Metro Council gets that these can help a neighborhood, but neighbors sometimes move into a neighborhood to live there and they don't want it overrun completely with short-term rentals. So that's kind of the intent of the regulations, is to find that balance.
So how did you guys come up with a 600-foot rule? Was there a lot of discussion about that? And what impact does it have when you have an owner-occupied property versus non-owner occupied? Can you, Joe, touch on that?
Well, the 600-foot rule came about with one of the changes to the ordinance over a year ago that I mentioned, which was before there was no distance requirement. So just so everyone's clear, that only applies to residential areas. It doesn't apply to commercial areas. But the idea behind that was people were concerned that 1 or 2 short-term rentals was okay, but 4 or 5, now it's becoming an issue. They wanted some safeguard in place. So there was going to be some kind of proximity requirement. We landed at a distance requirement because we felt that was the most fair thing. And the 600-foot, just so you know where that came up, that's typically the size of an urban block in Louisville. So that's the genesis of that. And when we looked at short-term rentals and neighborhoods that we felt were balanced, that's about how separated the legal ones were from one another, where we weren't getting complaints. So that's where we landed at with the 600-foot.
So once you put this 600-foot rule into place, what impact did it have on the existing Airbnbs type of short-term rentals? What did you guys see? And I understand there was a significant decline right immediately after that, right?
Well, when there was rumors of it going in, there was actually a rush to the door of people trying to get in before the rules changed, because council talked about that for several months before they put it into play. But as far as existing rentals, I would assume that it helped them because it limited competition in a way, but as far as new ones, it did slow people down because the Board of Zoning Adjustment, who can waive that requirement, have shown that you got to give them. At first, they were pretty lenient because they understood that people had applications in, they bought properties, they had an understanding that the rules were what the rules were when they made investments, and they gave a lot of relief to that. As of late, they've tightened it up a little bit, and I think people are a little bit more cautious of buying short-term rental properties in areas that have a lot of them, like certain parts of the Highlands, certain parts of Old Louisville. So what we're seeing is a lot of people branching out into new neighborhoods, which don't have a lot of them, where they don't have to worry about that rule. I don't know, David
So
would
if
probably be a much better person to answer that question of the impact on
so
the
if I wanted to buy something and I want to find out whether I can do this or not, is there a place that I can go to on your website to see what's in the 600-foot radius? Or do we need to call your office to figure that out?
I'll let Rachel answer that because she answers that question every day and does far better job than me.
Awesome.
So for knowing if your, proposed property is within 600 feet of another property, there is actually now a map that you can go to, and I can provide that link where you can search that property, and it'll let you know if it is subject to that 600-foot rule. And also just for general questions, I mean, I always recommend just giving us a call if you're not sure before pulling any trigger on making a purchase. We're always happy to talk to you, but we definitely have several online resources now that can be used for searching a property.
So Rachel, if you could kindly put this link in the chat box, and then everybody
Sure.
will be able to see it. That would be great. Okay, David, do you have any questions for Rachel or Joe about this? Is something that is on your mind?
No, not particularly. They're both a wealth of knowledge, and they're both a great reason as to why I'm able to kind of understand everything that's going on. And also to caveat off what Rachel was saying, and maybe Joe or Rachel, y'all can tell me. I know that there's the new kind of tool and logic that's linked from the Louisville short-term rental website. But one thing I've traditionally used is, like, I've used Logic and created a buffer and selected in the planning section for CUPs and been able to kind of highlight an area. Is that still pretty accurate? As far as I know, not all CUPs are for short-term rental and therefore wouldn't be impactful, but is that still an accurate way of doing that?
So it is pretty accurate. It's not updated as frequently as the map made specifically for short-term rental conditional use permits. It also does not show registrations. So the conditional use permit maps and also just the neighborhood maps show registered properties where that's not reflected on just a regular Logic webpage.
So Rachel and Joe, are you guys, are you able to share how many registered STRs we have in Jefferson County?
Sure. So just looking at our log, we have upwards of 2,000 properties registered currently. Was there any other questions you had about that?
No, I just wanted to and say, what's your what's in your pipeline? Do you have a lot of applications? Are you seeing a big increase, or this is kind of become steady at this point?
Well, with the COVID-19, that has definitely changed the amount of applications we've gotten in. Normally, we would see an influx come in around Derby time, but because that wasn't the traditional Derby this year, we did not see that. I would say it's been pretty steady, though. Okay. Not the regular burst we would see corresponding with, big events that the city has, but still running pretty steady.
But I'll add that the special approvals, I think we didn't touch on this, but if you live there and it's your home, you can just get the annual registration that Rachel was mentioning. And that number fluctuates. It goes up, it goes down. People decide to walk away from short-term rentals. People decide to start new ones, but it over time has gone steadily up. But the conditional uses are where you have residential area and it's not your primary residence. I think it's safe to say that those have kind of declined over the past year, if you're looking at a year over year since we launched the program in 2016.
So
But
can
not
I ask a
much.
question, Santosh?
It has gone down,
Yeah.
I would guess.
Go
On
for
the
it,
two,
Chris.
on the 2,000 number, is that reflective of owner occupant as well as people running these as more of a business, non-owner occupant, or is that broken out in any way? Or
Rachel can get stats to a degree, but that 2,000 total is just all short-term rentals, everybody lumped in. Anybody that registered online will be in that. We do try to get information about owner occupied or host occupied as part of the application, but some of our older applications, we didn't ask that. So we can give you an estimate, but I don't know if we can ever really give you a clear answer.
So one quick question, Joe. If I have a home and I want to rent it out, let's say Derby time, of course, this year doesn't count because we're putting 2020 behind us at this point, looking forward to 2021 and beyond. So if I want to rent it out, I need to apply for a permit to be able to do that because we see a lot of homes going up at Derby time.
Yeah, so Derby, a lot of things happen that aren't enforced, but when council adopted this, there was talks of a Derby week exemption. Um, they decided that they can't do that because where does it end? Because then somebody said, what about when the PGA comes to town? And somebody else said, what if we get a Sweet 16? And it just went on and on and on. That they decided that it would be too hard to single out a particular event. And then there were some other questions about the tax code was already in place. They didn't make any changes to that. They just interpreted, and that's not me and Rachel to answer any tax related questions. They felt that they were already, even if you rent one day of a year, if you hit their thresholds, you're subject to that. So there's no exemptions. You do it once, you need to be registered.
Let me ask another question here for the realtors to understand. Chris, can you share how do you go about finding properties, especially the inventory is extremely low in the Louisville market? Where do you go to find your Airbnb or short-term rental properties?
I mean, now I think, you can't, well, hopefully with this map, that's a great, I'm so glad to hear that there's a map and a search kind of function that's been made available. For me, I'm still going to call David probably, and then he's going to call Rachel or, something along those lines if I'm looking to purchase something that's residential, because quite frankly, in the areas where you want to own a short-term rental, that shop's pretty much closed. I hate to tell you. Now, if it's commercial or a different type of zoning, then that is an opportunity that you can go after. So like like I said, we bought the one in Nulu because it's in an enterprise zone where you can do that. But really at this point, I'm not, sorry, David, probably not looking to buy one other than, something that's either already permitted, which apparently you can, and this would be a question for the zoning folks, but it sounds like those can be transferred at this point. So if it's already permitted at this point, and there are a few, there's a couple for sale now, I saw the other day, where they're already permitted, and that could be attractive. They're going to want a premium. You can tell if you look at the pricing, you're buying something at a pretty high price. But the beauty of Airbnb is, for the most part, you're probably buying something that's pretty turnkey. You can walk in and get it. You might even on those fronts be able to buy that. You might be able to go and buy that furnished, or your only responsibility is going to be to roll in there and furnish it. So, and once you've got it furnished, then it's, turning it over to either, if you're going to do it yourself, I guess, and get it permitted. Actually, no, you don't get it permitted because it's already permitted. So, or you're buying commercial or some sort of non-residential zoning property. For us, we've bought a couple on the MLS. We've converted a couple that we had as long-term. It's kind of, I mean, it really does make, if you can find something permitted and you've got some money and you just want to go in and let your money work for you without doing a lot of work, or it's a commercially zoned property. I mean, what a great investment. It's pretty turnkey. You can roll in and start making money right away. But, you know, outside of that, you know, everybody asks me about these things all the time in terms of, you know, how do I go about buying these and all this? I just tell them, if you're buying residential property in Germantown, you know, et al., you know, Crescent Hill, Clifton, the areas where you're really going to be successful from a rental standpoint on these, pretty closed. Good luck. And I just tell them you can't buy it specifically for that, because that 600-foot rule is not going to allow you to buy it.
So one other question, Chris, when you look at this kind of properties for short-term rentals, do you have any criteria that for some reason, something like COVID happens? What's your fallback? What do you think about doing? Because
You know,
we have seen a lot of cancellations.
well, the beauty of real estate is it's flexible. And so I think you have to have that attitude. So when COVID hit, I was worried for a night, for about one night. I was very, very nervous because we have enough of these that, you know, you're going to be shut down. But you have to get out there and hustle, you know, and you just start to think about what other ways can we utilize these properties. So, and, you know, and I was doing that in conjunction. You know, thankfully, David, just to plug him a little bit, you know, I go to him and I just say, hey, man, listen, this isn't looking good for the short term. We're going to have to retool a bit and find ways to keep these, you know, full as best we can. And we know the rates aren't going to be as good, and the margins aren't going to be as good. So the beauty of being part of a big office like Keller Williams Louisville East is, what did I do? I went on our closed Facebook groups and said, hey guys, I got plenty of property for you. If you've got a seller who, I don't know, a buyer who's waiting on their build to be completed, right? Do they need a month? Do they need a month and a half? What do they need? So we started doing kind of I would call them kind of medium term, weird kind of rentals, where you could stash somebody for for however long they needed, quite frankly, because it worked for the time. And we really were fortunate that is a market that has always existed. We've known that always existed. If you do real estate, you know you've got people that need odd kind of terms to go and move in a place for a little while. But the beauty of it is we were set up to do it because we've already got furnished property, and you know, and really no events and no big draws from the community to bring short termers in. So you know, it was just set up. So we did it that way, and we were able to make it through, and we actually did okay. I'd rather have them all the way that they were intended, because we do better and I don't have to deal with it. But for the time being, you know, I feel very good about the way that went, and it kind of exhilarated me to get out there and get after it, and we had a big time. So
one of the things that I've looked for when I buy a property that's going to go short-term rental, I like to make sure that if things go bad in the economy, in the market, then as a traditional rental, it's going to cover my expenses. And I'm sure you look at that too.
yeah, I mean, I
mortgage
think
and all that.
yeah, I think you have to do that. This is such a new market. It's one of those things where when you're, you know, we had an appraisal done on this building we built, or that we bought in Nulu, and we needed to do a little rehab, you know, on it to get it up to standard. And, you know, you can sit there and now we actually have enough data to show here's what short-term rentals will bring. But the appraisers, they don't know what that even means. They don't think it's real. They think it's voodoo. Well, then you get something like, you know, COVID hitting, and, you know, it totally blows that theory up. So you really do have to still buy a sound, you know, as soundly as possible based on whatever situation that you're going to have to be in. So I think Airbnb type scenarios allow you to buy property that's turnkey, a little bit more retail priced than your average rental. But you, at the end of the day, you got to be able to fall back on the fact that, you know, this could happen. You could get a shutdown, and you're really sitting dead in the water unless you've got something that you can create just as a long-term deal for somebody. So
Well,
the other thing you asked, hey, Santosh, I keep saying it's hard to buy these now because of the 600-foot rule, because an urban block obviously is very densely populated. You're pretty much, if you've got one in one block, you're pretty much done. And the reason I say that that's the most attractive place because we know that Airbnbs, you're going to buy something that's walkable. People want to be able to go to places and get to the attractions that that a community has to offer quickly and easily. And let's face it, you're not going to be able to do that out in Lake Forest, right? So the thing that frustrated me about that rule is, as far as suburbia, like suburbia is never going to be affected by an over influx of Airbnbs. It just ain't happening. The market will not bear a bunch of people out in Lake Forest, renting their homes
Well,
out short term. It just ain't going to happen. So
think about this is that if you in an attractive area, if you buy a piece of property within a block, you have basically not yourself, but you left everybody else out too, because they won't be able to do anything unless it happens to be an owner occupied property or a zoning is different. So let's go to David. And so what brings people to Louisville, David? You do this all the time. Well, what's so attractive about coming to Louisville? What do you see happening here?
Well, so I mean, people really love bourbon. Lord knows I do. So that's really kind of been the drive of our tourism. As Joe actually pointed out earlier, Louisville was really kind of on the cusp of the whole short-term rental thing, except for the one weekend a year. Obviously, Derby and horse racing, that's always going to drive tourism. What has happened to this city, and if you are from here or you grew up here, you know that 10 years ago, you could fire a cannon down Broadway and you wouldn't hit a soul at 6 o'clock on a Friday. That has changed significantly. What the city has done, what the local government really has done to, develop and bring up this city and create tourism here is just, honestly, it's nothing short of really remarkable. If you're from here and you grew up here, So it's all the distilleries and the incentives that are available to them. It is all the distillery tours. It is, I'm starting to actually see some traffic for the soccer games. It's, there's tourist attractions. There are things to do here. And we also have an incredible food scene, absolutely incredible food scene that allows people to, get out and experience new things. There's just, and then the Danny Wimmer Presents and all the music festivals that we have here. We have 4 major music festivals per year in this city alone, which drives traffic. The convention center that was just finished on 4th Street. Unfortunately, we haven't got to see that put to use too terribly much yet. But that's massive. We have the Expo Center over off Phillips Lane. It's massive. There's been a ton of work that has gone into this city over the last probably 2 decades, really, that has created just a massive draw that has targeted successfully pretty much every demographic that you could want. That's really what has driven it. Now, obviously we can't have large gatherings, thus here we are. And that's affecting things. September would have been just unbelievable from a revenue standpoint, but it was just kind of good enough. That's kind of what you're looking at until some of those events can come back to a degree.
So let's touch on that. You saw a significant slowdown March, April, May timeframe. A lot of the bookings were canceled. People who had short-term rentals, they were barely able to make meet their expenses. So what are you starting to see now? We are not, this is a new normal now.
Yeah, that's a great question.
It's going to be a while before we get to where you have a robust activity.
I'm starting to see some things that are really beginning to pick up. I think you're starting to see a real return of confidence. October has been really good, really strong. I think that, obviously we had the COVID stuff. And when that happened, actually, the vacation rental industry shifted heavily towards, you want to talk about a market that's not going to recover for a long time, densely populated in places you have to fly to, the 4 corners of the United States, Southern California, Pacific Northwest, New York City, and South Florida. They're all going to take hits for a very long until people feel fully comfortable that we're over the COVID stuff. It's going to take a big hit. So what actually became popular was the 5-hour vacation. It's something that was reported pretty heavily and discussed pretty heavily in the short-term rental community. And Louisville is actually very well situated for that because you have all these feeder markets. Our largest feeder market is Chicago. But then we also have Nashville as a feeder market, Cincinnati is a feeder market, Columbus is a feeder market, Indianapolis is a feeder market. And then we actually get a lot from like Asheville and stuff. A lot of other traditional vacation markets actually come to Louisville for, just to experience something new. So Louisville actually made a lot of sense for that. Now we did run into, and we started, I think, to see that really kind of pick up like towards the end of June and into July. August always slows down a good bit because of like, that's back to school timeframe, even though no one really necessarily went back to school per se, or not as many. But then September, I think there was a lot of fears that we faced just a lot of cancellations. I think I told everybody it was just such a strange month. There was a lot of fear that there would be rioting. Thankfully, all the the protesters, wherever anyone falls on that, were extremely peaceful, which is wonderful. So with that, we're now in a place where we're really starting to see an uptick. We really are. This October, usually the big draw in October is the jack-o'-lantern thing that they do at Iroquois Park. And usually it's Ironman. Ironman's canceled. Ironman's gone. That's unfortunate. However, I mean, you kind of take that out of it, and this kind of starts to look like a pretty normal October for the most part. It's really pretty impressive. So I think that some of those things really are indicative
let
to
me-
the sign. What's that? I think
I was
that's
going to ask you, go ahead.
I think some of those things are indicative of some sort of return to normalcy when coupled with the fact that people are less likely to stay in hotels.
So if I were to come to you, David, and said, "Hey, David, outside of finding the property in the right area and all of that, what would be the ideal short-term rental property to buy at this time? A small one, 2 bedrooms, or a larger ones? What do you think would work best?"
I would say it'd probably be 3 beds with 2 baths and up. With 3 beds and up, 2 baths and up. That would really kind of be your sweet spot as far as getting the maximum return on investment. Multi-unit can always make sense, but again, has to be zoned correctly. You can't just do it with anything. I believe it's got to be either commercial. You can do a duplex in an OR1 or an OR2, but commercial, you can do beyond that. I think EZs, and I'm sure Rachel.
OR1, I think.
You can't do anything larger than a duplex, I believe, for an OR1. But
Oh, really? Okay.
yeah, or
All right.
you're limited to the duplex.
So if I wanted to have a short-term rental and I decide I want to manage it myself, what are some of the challenges that I'm going to face compared to working with somebody like you?
Well, I obviously, for obvious reasons, I'm not a huge advocate of that. I'm sure everyone could understand why. But the challenges that you're really going to face are you really kind of have to be available all the time. There's actually, my staff is out right now, but I've actually responded to inquiries while we've been on this call. I've had to speak with my maintenance supervisor, and she's out there, doing some things that she needs to be doing. And, sometimes you run into situations like what we just did, where a guest did not check out on time, but, we got to do what we have to do here. And then you have to know the industry, you have to know, there's a lot of different controls that we put in place that allow us to screen guests. Experience has taught us, how to recognize when something might be problematic or troublesome. That's a product of lessons learned. There's certainly, it's possible to self-manage. I wouldn't do it with too many units. And I think that, you also have to consider like cost to clean. That can really eat away at margins very quickly. Like I said, we're kind of like IKEA. We actually don't really make anything on the cleaning. Sometimes we actually technically would lose. So the percentage kind of makes up for that. But it's keeping cleaning costs low is difficult. And then scheduling. That's a real challenge associated with it, because it's not the kind of thing where you can just call Molly maids. Sometimes you do, back-to-backs. We do them frequently. And when you have back-to-backs, you need to be able to coordinate somebody to get in there and take care of it, between 11 and 5 p.m. Taking care of the linens and making sure that gets handled. In theory, yes, you could have a washer and dryer in there, but you have a 6-bed home, and that washer and dryer is not going to support that. So you're actually going to end up paying somebody probably some period of time to wait. We're able to handle that all on site. Self-managing is possible. Again, just there's a lot. I think when people initially look at the idea, they think to themselves, okay, well, I'll set pricing. I'll find somebody to clean it and I'll book it and just do the communication. There is quite a bit more to it than that. To continue to make these things profitable, I can tell you that we spend $36,000 a year on technology. And that technology that we utilize does what I used to do manually. And it doesn't make a ton of sense to do it until you work at the volume that we do. And even that still requires extensive babysitting. I call it babysitting the algorithm. You have to stay on top of it. You have to adjust for seasonality. You have to adjust when things like COVID and stuff come into play. Will it detect demand? Absolutely, but not the way that your eyes can. So you really have to stay on top of it. The maintenance is always a challenge, keeping up with, the yards. And I mean, for instance, yesterday I had to go fix an oven. A temperature probe went out on it. Somebody wanted to bake. They said we brought a bunch of food. When you're dealing with short-term rental guests, oftentimes they're just here for 2 days. And something like that can really kind of cramp their stay. I've gotten pretty good at diagnosing some small appliance issues, but in this case, they prepared a bunch of food. And if I didn't go over there and take care of it yesterday, I was able to go source a temperature probe and get it replaced, and everything worked fine. But if I wasn't able to do that, either A, I was going to have to refund them for their food because they couldn't necessarily cook it at that point, or I was going to have to give them something back on their stay, maybe both. The reality is that if you advertise the amenity, it better be working. And Airbnb will give you that. They kind of play the arbitrator. They're the third party, and they will and that's where 65 to 70% of all the business comes from. They'll let you have an opportunity to correct it, but it can't be like, we've all been a long-term tenant or experienced long-term, rentals before. It can't be, we'll get someone out there in a day or so. It's usually pretty quick. You have to respond. That's a big challenge.
So let me, one quick question, then I want to go to Rachel and Joe again. Have you ever had anybody overstaying past their time that you had to find some way to get them out?
We've had some people who, yeah, that happened one time. We've hosted more than 5,000 trips. It happened one time. You have people who, they see the checkout time is 11, but they don't want to listen to it, and they'll just take their time and they'll mosey on out of there without much of a fuss. But yeah, it can happen. And, the big thing, obviously, I think everyone worries about is like squatters' rights and stuff like that. If something like that comes up, I haven't had anybody really attempt to do that, but I've come up with unique solutions for when guests are a little troublesome and don't want to do the things they're supposed to do. So we take care of it.
All right, sounds good. Let's just go to Rachel and Joe again. And again, I really want to thank them for being here. So Rachel, can you talk about the process for registration? Let's say I found a piece of property and it meets the requirements of, there is nothing else within 600 feet and I'm good to go. What's that process? What do I need to do?
So it can go two ways. So depending on if it's zoned residentially, a conditional use permit may be required, in which case you'll have to go through that process. If it's zoned commercially or it has an existing conditional use permit, you would just register the property using the short-term rental annual registration form. It's a form that you'll submit to our department, and then it takes normally about 10 business days for us to turn it around and get it back to you.
Yeah.
So, it's
So what
pretty
about the
straightforward.
cup? Can you talk a little bit
Mhm.
more about the cup process, please?
Sure. So if a conditional use permit is required, this definitely takes a bit more time and energy than just a registration form. The first step is a pre-application. Through this process, you'll just be submitting an application to our department. We'll do a staff report, see if there's any immediate red flags, for example, that 600-foot map. You'll also be responsible for hosting a neighborhood meeting. We'll be inviting surrounding property owners to a meeting to let them know kind of candidly what you plan on doing here, answer any questions they may have. And then once you've done that, you'll formally file. So this is similar to the pre-application, just a little meatier. You'll be submitting proof of that neighborhood meeting. And once we have gotten that formal file and it's complete, you'll be docketed to go to the Board of Zoning Adjustment, which is a public hearing, in which case the board will then hear your case and vote on whether or not to grant the conditional use permit.
So let me ask you about another scenario that I have a piece of property I want to get cup, but there is already another property within 600 feet that's already approved. So is this process any different?
So you would still go through the conditional use permit process. It's just at the end, when you're in front of the Board of Zoning Adjustment, you'll have to ask for relief from that 600-foot rule and provide justification of why they should do so.
So what kind of things that they look for justification, or have you seen them approving these or not? I think Joe
Sure.
was saying that
Yeah.
we can.
So
Go
some
ahead.
justification could be if you're, within walking distance or very close to a commercial corridor, or a popular street that has a, bunch of bars, like Bardstown Road, for example. Other justifications could be more kind of like what Joe was saying, when you had that pre-app in prior to the 600-foot rule going into effect, but we're not really seeing that much anymore since it's been over a year now since it's been in effect.
So what about, Rachel, what about fees? How much does it cost to register and then maintaining the registration?
So for the conditional use permit, that is going to be $150 for the pre-application and then $565 for the formal file, but that's a one-time fee. You just pay that once with the conditional use permit process. Once you've gotten the conditional use permit, there's a $100 annual registration fee, and you'll pay that once a year.
So let's talk briefly about enforcement. How do you go about enforcing, making sure that these are really truly short-term rentals and nobody is renting it out for 3, 4, 6 months at a time? And things may have been a little bit different when COVID came, but typically, how do you go about making sure that this happens? Do you have enough manpower to do this?
That's probably a better question for Joe. He works more on the enforcement side.
Okay.
So the first thing about enforcement, that for now, it's complaint-based. This could change at any time. That's a policy, that's not a law. So we don't go out looking for unlawful short-term rentals. We will investigate any complaint that comes in. So what we're finding out is, if you go through all this process and you go through all this investment like a good host like David does, you probably aren't that pleased when somebody, takes the shortcut and just opens up and throws a listing up on a platform. So we're finding it's pretty self-policing, that the hosts are the ones reporting the other host. And that's really reduced the complaints that we've received over the past few years. But occasionally neighbors will call them in, and sometimes they misunderstand what a short-term rental is. They'll call in boarding houses, which is something different, or just a family that they don't recognize. But we do get those complaints. We take them in and we look at them on case by case. We have a pretty good relationship considering their relationship with other cities, with Airbnb and HomeAway, where if we have a problem property, we have agreements that they will actually remove their listings at our request. So we have a system in place for that too. But just to answer the broader question of what happens when you're found not in compliance, we have a fine if you're on a platform without a registration, and we worked with the platforms to make sure that they allow you to put a registration number on the page in a conspicuous place. And we have a fine that escalates up to $1,000 a day for people that actually operate. Because you might be on the platform, but you're not actually doing it. That's kind of like saying, I'm going to commit a burglary, but I didn't actually do it. So that's a different fine than actually doing it, which is much more severe.
So when you have somebody is trying to get a conditional use permit and you have neighbors come and complain, and even after that complaining, the property is approved for short-term rental, usually those are the kind of neighbors who are going to keep an eye on it to see if there is some violation that they can find and then come after and complain. How do you go about differentiating between a real complaint and it's just a neighbor who is just not happy about having an STR?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's certainly people who, I mean, there's different types of complainants. Sometimes their hosts turning in. I mean, this happens with any business industry, not just short-term rentals, where you turn in your competition that isn't doing it right. Then you have neighbors who have viable concerns. Then you have neighbors who just don't like their neighbor and are looking up whatever they do and turning it over to the city to investigate. So, and then you even have some people who have appointed themselves as short-term rental police and go looking for people outside of their neighborhood. We deal with the personalities and enforcement, it's part of it, but at the end of the day, we make a fact-based decision, and if we're going to issue a citation, we need evidence.
Right.
You don't issue a citation just because a neighbor says you're doing it. We have to have some kind of evidence that you did it.
Right. Well, we're approaching noon almost here, so I want to open it up for everybody that is on this call here. If they have any questions for either Rachel, Joe, or David, go ahead and shoot.
I have one.
Okay,
Oh, somebody else have one?
go for it.
I don't want to, if somebody else has one. Okay.
We'll get to the other. So
Okay,
if
gotcha.
they have to,
I was curious about because I get this question a lot. People talking about maybe buying a duplex and living in one of the units and then doing an Airbnb in the other unit, or I'm buying a property that has a carriage house or maybe might have a carriage house someday. Do I have any advantage if I'm actually living on the property, even though there's additional units going on? Does that give me a pass on the 600-foot rule? That kind of question.
So it's not an immediate pass if it's zoned residentially. That could be used as justification to ask the board to waive the 600-foot rule. It's still completely up to the board, but I have seen that been used as justification. If the host lives on, or it's owner occupied in one of the dwelling units on site.
Thanks. Cool.
anybody else? So I have one final question for Rachel and Joe, maybe Joe. What do you guys see as the future of short-term rentals in our market?
I don't know. I think it's growing, and it's growing into other neighborhoods. We'll see. David pointed out that the suburbs are kind of the last frontier. They're typically not in the suburbs when we look at our map. They're kind of scattered outside of 264, but I think a lot of homeowners associations block those through their own deed restrictions. We'll see if that kind of changes over time. But I mean, we've just seen steady growth over the past few years, and our council has shown that they're supportive of this, and as long as it's not a detriment to the neighbors. So I don't anticipate any changes to our ordinance coming over the next few years, but that could change at any time in politics. So, but for now, I think it's we just see, it just continuing on the way it has been over the past few years.
So the city council here is pretty comfortable with the new regulation. They do not see any need to tighten it further.
Council's about to change, so ask me again in a few months when we have new members. But I can only say that the current version of the ordinance, I think, was voted 25-1. And the one person who voted against it, I think, just had issues with one provision and didn't, want to take the whole thing if they weren't comfortable with that one provision. So I think that shows that they're supportive of short-term rentals if they're properly regulated.
We have a question in the chat from Ty. She's wondering, are the application fees per investor or per property?
Yeah, so it's going to be per dwelling unit. So if you own a property that's a duplex, you'd actually be paying $100 for each unit within that duplex.
Okay, thank you.
So one final thing before we let Joe and Rachel go, we asked a few questions here that I could think of and some input from others. Is there something else that I should have asked you that I missed? Is there something that you guys think that is really important from an investment perspective?
I would only add, and I think this group is doing their due diligence just by attending this meeting, but the worst thing we hear is the people who buy it, then ask if they can do it. I would ask if you could do it, then buy it. If you have that opportunity, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But these people that come before the Board of Zoning Adjustment and say, but I bought it, what else can I do with it? They're not, even if they cared about that argument, they legally can't consider it. That's not justification. You screwing up or not doing your research is not justification. They can't use that to give you relief to the 600-foot rule, or if all the neighbors show up and there's other reasons to deny the application.
Ignorance is not a bliss.
Right.
Well, and you see it. I mean, you see it agents are out there advertising property as this would be a good Airbnb, and they have there's no way to, you can't do that as a professional. You shouldn't be saying that. So anyway,
That happens all the time. I get calls about it all the time. There's people who are constantly, they'll say, in the listing description, would make a great Airbnb. And if I may, real quick, I want to show something that Rachel had talked about earlier. Let me see if I can do this.
Or share a screen.
Yeah.
Have you as a co-host, it should allow you.
Let's see. It's making me open system preferences. Oh, great. Okay.
She's entire screen.
Yeah, right.
It's usually the one.
Okay. I don't guess it's working. Here we go. I think it's going to let me.
Yep.
Let me know if we can see that. Can we see?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so this is the tool that Rachel was actually talking about earlier. And you can access this on the city's website. And here is a property that I actually asked Rachel about for a client, and we'll bring that up. And we can see that this property actually would probably be able to get a permit without needing any kind of relief from the 600-foot rule. What I've done over here is I've used the handy dandy tools, and this will actually show us 600-foot circles for all confirmed current registrations and permits. And it will also show us impacted properties, because remember, like for instance, no one's putting one on St. Michael Cemetery, but I think we can see right here where I'm kind of hovering around. It shows this pink. That means it's impacted. Even if that 600-foot just hits the corner of it, the corner of the lot, it's considered impacted. So you won't be able to do that. And if you look, to kind of caveat off of what Chris Thomas was kind of referring to, this is basically a little bit of the Highlands right up here. This is Germantown, and this is kind of getting into Shelby Park a little bit. Okay, all of this, as we can see, is very, very densely populated and affected. There's just a handful of little spots out here where we could potentially be able. Now you look and you see all downtown. It's like, why are there nothing downtown? Because most everything downtown is zoned office, residential, or commercial. The vast majority of it is. So you actually don't really need any permits to purchase things down here. And then sometimes you have the stuff that is commercial, or I'm sorry, the like condos and stuff like that. And it's kind of up to them as far as if they'll let you do that. But you get into Butchertown, obviously, Butchertown is pretty much 100% off the grid unless you get into something that has the correct zoning. And the same pretty much goes for Crescent Hill. About the same thing. So anybody have any questions on that?
So,
I might be able to
There is a question that came from Larry Gaddy. He was saying that what happens if you decide to convert your short-term rental back into a long-term rental, I believe? Do we have to request a cancellation, or is there a variance you can get that for a short while you can do it and then go back?
That would be a Joe or Rachel question.
So we did put a clause. We didn't want people just basically holding a seat at the table and basically denying another person the opportunity to come in and get approval just because they wanted to get theirs in advance. So if you have a conditional use permit and you don't want to continue doing short-term rentals, you have the option of keeping your license active, and we can't make you do the rental. So it's really, we can make you keep the license active. If you decide not to pay that fee and let that license lapse, then if it sits inactive for 6 months, you lose your conditional use permit and it takes you off that map that David just showed.
Awesome. All right, guys. David, that's it, right? Do you have anything else you want to share, or we're good? All right. Hey, thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody. Joe, Rachel, David, Chris, thanks for being on this panel.
you all.
I appreciate it.
Yes,
Thank
thank you
you.
all.
See ya. Bye.
Appreciate you.